Own appointed limits keep. O hear us as we pray to thee for those in peril on the sea. Amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Okay, we have a couple of proclamations, the first of which Councilmember Prafke will present, National Garden Week.
I am happy to do this as a Florida Master Gardener myself. Proclamation, City of Punta Gorda, Florida. Whereas gardeners have a passion for nurturing the beauty and resources of the earth through the planting of seeds, the care of all plants, and the riches of their efforts. And whereas gardeners seek to add beauty, splendor, fragrance, and nutrition to our lives through the growing of herbs, vegetables, foliage, and flowers. And whereas gardening furnishes a challenging and productive activity for our citizens, for those just learning as well as those having years of experience. And whereas gardening promotes a healthy lifestyle that lasts a lifetime, helps reduce stress from other areas of our life, and teaches that rewards can come from diligent efforts. And whereas gardening enables members of the Port Charlotte, Punta Gorda, and Lemon Bay Garden Clubs to promote community interest in horticulture, further the art of amateur gardening, and serve others. Now therefore, the City Council of the City of Punta Gorda, Florida, does hereby proclaim June 4th through 10th, 2017 as National Garden Week, and encourages residents to acknowledge the importance of gardening and the numerous contributions of gardeners and garden clubs, passed and duly adopted in regular session this 7th day of June, 2017, City of Punta Gorda, Florida. Rachel Kiesling, Mayor, and accepting is, excuse me, Venida Jones. Did I say that right? If you'd like to say something.
National Garden Week, they have great shirts.
Okay, go ahead.
I just want to thank everybody on behalf of Punta Gorda Garden Club. Thank you.
You want to speak into the,
No, that's good.
okay. Do you want to introduce your colleagues?
Yes, this is Suzanne McCormick and Carol Houston. She's our Vice President.
Thank you, ladies. Okay, next we have the Caribbean American Heritage Month proclamation by Councilmember Cummings.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Whereas Caribbean Americans have contributed greatly to education, fine arts, business, literature, journalism, sports, fashion, politics, government, the military, music, science, technology, and all other areas of the United States. And whereas Caribbean Americans share their culture through carnivals, festivals, music, dance, film, literature, which enriches the cultural landscape. And whereas we celebrate the contributions of Caribbean Americans and pay tribute to the common culture and bonds of friendship which unite us as people. And whereas the Caribbean Jerk and Cultural Festival Incorporated is a nonprofit, community-based multicultural organization dedicated to hosting events which increases cross-cultural understanding, acceptance, and interaction between peoples of diverse nationalities and heritage through art, music, and cuisine of the Caribbean islands. And whereas National Caribbean American Heritage Month is an opportunity to honor and celebrate the history, culture, and essential role of Caribbean Americans in Punta Gorda and across the country. Now, therefore, the City Council of the City of Punta Gorda does hereby proclaim the month of June 2017 a Caribbean American Heritage Month, passed until the adopted regular session the 7th day of June 2017 by our Mayor Rachel Kiesling. And this is given to Sonia Owens and Omar Berry.
You want to say a few words?
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thanks for having us here. Well, as he has formally introduced me, Omar Berry, Sonia Owens, and as the president of the Caribbean Jerk and Culture Fest, we just want to say thank you in every way. Ms. Owens, she has worked very hard in making this possible and being with you guys to take it to another level where we can reach out to family more in our community, to give to our community. That's the goal, that's the aim. Thank you for helping us to execute this vision. God bless you.
Thank you.
And we also would like to announce that on Sunday, June the 25th, at the Port Charlotte Beach Complex, we will be actually having a celebration to celebrate the Caribbean American Heritage Month, where we'll have food, drinks. It's free and open to the public. It'll be live music. It's for the family. So if you could come out and join us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have a 15-year service award.
Yes, we do.
They're trying to hide, but we see them.
We have a 15-year service award for a member of one of our more beloved service areas, Ricky Platt, Senior Crew Chief in Sanitation.
Good morning. You can stay up there if you want. My name is Jenna Black. I am the sanitation supervisor for the Public Works Department. We're here today to recognize Ricky Platt for his 15 years of excellent service to the city. Ricky is a senior crew chief for the sanitation division. He was born in 1963 and graduated from Charlotte High. He has 15 wonderful grandchildren who he spends a lot of his time with. He enjoys watching youth sports, and he's a big Seminoles fan. Ricky is my go-to guy whenever it comes to picking up anything throughout the city. I can count on him for anything. He'll help me no matter what it is, white goods, piles, bulk pickups. He's great. He's very reliable. So for being the new supervisor for the Public Works Department for the Sanitation Division, I know I can count on him. He's wonderful. He's my go-to, and he's reliable. He's there every day, rain or shine. So a lot of you have seen him run the clamshell truck. He picks up the tractor piles, the white goods, and everything else. So I know he gets everything done, and he's our fall-to guy. So here's to you, Ricky, and thank you and congratulations.
Thank you, Ricky. Thanks for keeping our city clean, Ricky. You're doing an excellent job. Next, we have a recap of the 2017 state legislative session, and the wizard has landed.
Yes, he has.
He has. He's got a big bag, too.
By the way, the wizard is Jerry Paul. He's our city's lobbyist, and he comes every year to give us a recap.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Howard, members, council members. Yeah, the legislative session this year was a little bit different, but the truth is that they're all a little bit different. And, they're governed by a whole host of factors. I'll talk a little bit about what governed the factors making this session a little bit different, and what actually passed, what actually failed, what we're likely to see come back, and what's happening, quite frankly, right now as we speak with a new special session from Wednesday to Friday on some budget issues. So to put this in a broader context, some of this is a recap. Most people know this, but some don't. Of course, we have general election cycle every 2 years, but every other one of those is a presidential election cycle. All of Florida's cabinet level positions, such as governor, attorney general, agriculture commissioner, and chief financial officer, are up for election in the off-year term. So this legislative session that we just finished, which was a 60-day annual session beginning in March, was obviously right after a presidential cycle. And so a lot of the members of the legislature and members of the cabinet are looking to the next election, of course. That governs some considerations. And that's 2 years, ostensibly 2 years away. And because it's an off-year election, you have, I would say, super sensitivity by the cabinet members who are all termed out, and those seats are then up as well. So most people have the perception that, well, most of the political activity goes on during a presidential election cycle. Well, in Florida, it's kind of the opposite, because all of our state-level positions, and most of the legislative positions are up that period as well. So with the presidential election cycle, though, you turn over the leadership of both the House and the Senate, and so you get a new Speaker and a new Senate President, and they're working together ostensibly for the first time. And of course, personalities and ideology and style matter a lot. So during this legislative session, we had a new Speaker of the House, Richard Corcoran, and a new President of the Senate, Joe Negron, and they have some competing views on some key issues. Typically, a new Speaker or a new Senate President has a host of priorities that are particularly of interest to them, and a lot of policy issues tend to get tied in with those in a negotiating or strategic posture. So, for example, the House side, a couple of their main priorities were to rein in what they framed as corporate welfare in the context of economic development programs. They have felt as though things like Enterprise Florida and Visit Florida, that although they don't disagree that the programs can be of value, they believe that maybe they haven't had enough oversight, that they've grown too much, and they see it as corporate welfare. Obviously, that's a huge priority for the governor, and so there was a natural tension over those issues. Ultimately, what happened in that one was that the funding for Visit Florida was cut from $75 million down to about $26 million. The funding for that was the funding for Visit Florida. The funding for Enterprise Florida was cut from, I think, $25 million down to $16 million. That is one of the issues, by the way, that has been put back on the table after the session via a proclamation by the governor calling the legislature back up there to add more money. So I'll get to that in a moment. On the Senate side, priorities were things like Senator Negron wanted a heavy focus on resolving environmental issues related to discharges of water from Lake Okeechobee and the things that the downstream effects that folks in our community saw through the Caloosahatchee River and Charlotte Harbor, and also on the other side with Indian River Lagoon, where the high nitrate levels obviously had a major impact on the water quality. And so historically, there has been a belief that what needs to happen, in addition to the historic Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or SERP, that was put in place under Jeb Bush, working with the federal government, to try to restore the flow to the River of Grass, the natural southerly flow. There's been a belief that didn't go far enough, and that more storage was necessary, more reservoirs. And so Senator Negron wanted to make that a priority. That costs a lot of money. So that was a heavily negotiated issue because that was not a priority of the House. Ultimately, what happened on that one was that the budget did include funding for ultimately $1.5 billion worth of acquisition of land to create reservoirs of approximately 60,000 acre feet of water, if you can do that math. A lot of water. Basically, it comes out of Lake Okeechobee and the Kissimmee Chain of Lakes, and it would stage in those reservoirs before they get further released. As I said, it's $1.5 billion, half by the federal government, half by the state, about $64 million of which to be paid out of this year's budget, and then the rest bonded over time. So the point that I'm making is that the Senate got some of its priorities, not as big as it wanted. The House got some of its priorities, and then a lot of other things died. In the mix of that, obviously, there were a host of bills that we had to fend off. I say we as the city of Punta Gorda, because we saw them adverse to our interests, adverse to the interests of the people of the city of Punta Gorda. And so I'll run through some of those. But there was generally a trend or a theme this year, after a very robust election cycle, of a fair number of bills coming forward that were a reflection of things that candidates had been hearing on the campaign trail, most of which were somewhat anecdotal from other parts of the state and don't necessarily don't necessarily apply directly in the way that we do business here. But so, for example, some of the preemption bills, Community Redevelopment Agency bill that was very contentious, that worked its way almost to final passage but then failed, would have put significant restrictions on the ability of a local community to create a community redevelopment agency in a particular area where it had become blighted and you needed to use tax increment financing in order to rejuvenate that area and bring in fresh businesses and new development and attract investors. In some parts of the state, and there's over 400 of these CRAs, in some parts of the state, there have been some examples where state audits of those CRAs have shown that there has not been strong or transparent financial controls over those. Some of them have engaged in mission creep, if you will, and there are people in other parts of the state where that's happened who have gotten very frustrated and become very vocal. And so there was a bill this session that would have essentially said you can't create any more CRAs without a special act of the legislature. So from the legislator's perspective, they feel like they needed to respond to that problem and get greater control over that. From a local government's perspective, it feels as though there's an erosion of local control. Ultimately, that bill did not pass. Some bills that did pass, for example, implementation of the solar property tax exemption that passed during this last election cycle as a ballot initiative in the Constitution. That did ultimately pass, and the governor just signed that 2 days ago. Essentially, that exempts certain commercial properties from additional property tax assessments based upon the increased value by adding solar panels. And then it also applies to non-residential as to personal property tax exemptions. That's a bill that passed. Most of the traditional sales tax holidays passed. The biggest portion of the tax cut package was a reduction in sales tax on commercial rents. That's something that receives a lot of attention in Tallahassee every single year by a lot of small businesses that are affected by that quite a bit. Another bill that passed that was heavily supported by us and by the League of Cities with whom we work very closely and collaborate is public records request reform. In some parts of the state, there has been a small number of attorneys, law firms who have exploited that process. In my view, and in the view of many people across the state, actually abused it, taken advantage of it, used it as a gotcha scenario, and caused the taxpayers a lot of money in attorney's fees that were absolutely unnecessary. Originally, we put attorney's fee provisions in the statute for public records requests so that local governments have an incentive, or if you will, to work with people who are simply wanting fair and open public records. When they make a request for a document, they don't want to be stonewalled by a county or a city, and that's understandable. Most local governments don't stonewall, and they understand and they comply with it. But you've got a small group of attorneys who have kind of figured out a trick that they can run over to a city hall and talk to a clerk who may not be involved in public records at all and say, hey, I want the following 5,000 pages of documents that are scattered across every division, and I want it by noon tomorrow. And they'll write that down. And then they'll run back and the day after and they'll say, my gosh, I asked for it and you didn't give it to me. And they'll do that again and again and again. And 2 days later, they'll file suit down at the courthouse and say, the government's stonewalling me. And, oh, by the way, there's an attorney fee provision here. So the court ultimately says we are entitled to the documents. There's nothing in there saying when, right? So that it's kind of a gotcha. So then the attorney gets to submit an affidavit, for his time, and that has to be paid by the city. And the city, of course, then has to exact that from the taxpayers. There are a lot of people who had enough of that. And so we passed a bill this year that said timeout. Yes, there should be a reasonable attorney's fee so that people aren't having to reach into their own pocket to force the government to comply, but it shouldn't be a gotcha scenario. So that bill passed. Now there's a 5-day period. They have to give reasonable notice. They have to put you on notice. They can't just exploit the process. So that was a bill that was strongly supported by us and by the league, and it did pass. There's an additional homestead tax exemption measure that passed the legislature to be placed on the ballot in 2018 for an amendment to the Constitution. Essentially, it's for assessments of properties valued between $100,000 and $125,000. That'll be on the ballot in 2018, and if it receives 60% support by the electors across the state of Florida, then that would be an increase to that homestead tax exemption. By the way, that is calculated to have about $650 million impact on all on local governments statewide, but that did make it through. Vacation rental bill. That's a bill that has been banging around the legislative sessions now for 10 years or so, and continues to and will continue to. The bill ultimately did not pass this year, but it got an awful lot of attention. And just to provide a little insight, here's why. The vacation rental issue, just like the Uber issue and a lot of these other shared economy topics, are continuing to be a bigger and bigger political football, because quite frankly more and more people are accessing this shared economy and see it as a form of freedom. People don't want to be limited to just using a taxi. They want to have the benefits that they see in using Uber and using Lyft. So too with vacation rentals. They don't want to be limited. They want the additional options of being able to go online and choose houses, not just hotels. And that trend is not going to go away. But those trends are in conflict with the way that we've always done business in the past. And I think most local governments would be fine with modifying their local regulations to accommodate those types of market-based trends. The problem is that you'll get some small communities, some local governments, not here, but in other parts of the state, who are not rational, who are not reasonable, who simply want to stop that, but that's like stopping the tide. And so you then get legislators who say, you know what, enough's enough. We're going to pass a statewide law and say that no local governments can ban Uber or Lyft, or no local governments can ban vacation rentals. So it's a competing interest. Doing it on the state level like that goes too far. Doing nothing they see as not going far enough. But the vacation rental bill did not make it through this year, but I'm sure it will get filed again next year. Some other bills of particular interest, and then I'll take some questions. Another bill that was filed this year was mandatory body cameras for law enforcement. That did not pass. That was a bill that the League of Cities and most all cities opposed. There was another preemption bill that would have preempted to state control the setting of election cycles for local elected officials. And here in Punta Gorda and most municipalities and counties in our neck of the woods, we'd say, well, why do you really need that? We can set our own, we can determine when we want to have our elections. And that's true. But if you go to some other parts of the state, if you go to some other counties where there's 50 or 60 municipalities, and they structure their elections in ways, quite frankly, so that nobody really knows when they are supposed to go to the polls, they feel disenfranchised. They want some certainty, some clarity. In some of these places between special districts and municipalities and counties, incorporated, non-incorporated areas, somebody may have 5 or 6 or 7 different elections that affect them. And if they're all scattered on different dates, they finally get to where they can't figure out when they're supposed to vote, and they don't vote at all. So there was a measure that said, look, simplify that, pick from one of 4 time periods, and have them all at least on one of those 4 so that people have reasonable notice. But from our perspective, it looks like eroding local authority. Like a lot of these things that you read about, that you see happening in Tallahassee, they make sense in one part of the state, they may not make sense in our part of the state. So just a little background on that. There was a preemption bill that passed on the regulation of drones. Again, not a big problem in our area, but in some parts of the state, you can get a local government that'll ban drones outright. And you say, well, that goes too far. And so state legislators say, look, we can't allow you to simply eliminate people's rights to use this new technology, to prevent the real estate industry and the engineering fields and local governments themselves to use this technology. So there was a preemption bill that said that the regulation of drones is preempted to state authority, although those local ordinances that are in place that may or may not affect drones can still stay in place and can still be enforced. So, for example, if you have a nuisance ordinance, most of us, I think, know what a nuisance ordinance. You don't have to repeal your nuisance ordinance, and a nuisance ordinance would still apply to a drone. If somebody is using that technology to create a nuisance or to violate somebody's privacy, the preemption doesn't mean that your local ordinance no longer is enforceable. It means that you can't enact new ordinances specifically tailored to drones. I mentioned the shared economy, Uber and Lyft. There was a state preemption bill for Uber and Lyft that essentially said ride sharing is going to be regulated on the state level, preempting local authority over that. And then they negotiated a whole host of regulations and restrictions, insurance requirements, background checks, and so on for those ride sharing services. But local governments are not free to regulate them. Again, you have some local governments who, out of loyalty to the lobbyists for the taxi industry or whatever, will just ban Uber. And then you get a lot of residents who say, well, I want that right. I want the ability to choose Uber. So that preemption bill went into place. The compromise at the end was, however, that airports and seaports and local governments can still charge a pickup fee so long as the pickup fee is not discriminatory. In other words, if there's a pickup fee that you have in place that applies to taxi cabs at an airport, you can apply that same pickup fee to Uber. But what you can't do is go beyond that and try to favor taxis over Uber. So that was another bill. Quick recap on the budget. It's about an $83 billion budget this year. The governor signed most of the major pieces of it. He vetoed a historic level of local projects, over 400 projects totaling almost $500 million that he vetoed. And he also vetoed the education funding piece. And it's for that purpose that he has called the legislature back up to session for today through Friday to try to add some funding to the education silo, and also he's going to try to get them to add some money back to Enterprise Florida and Visit Florida. And then the Senate wants to expand the call or the framework of that proclamation, the jurisdiction of it, to also add about $100 million or so to healthcare funding issues. Last thing I would mention is Constitutional Revision Commission. Some of you may have heard a little bit about that or read about it in the paper a bit. Florida is unique. It's the only state in the country that has a provision in its constitution that says that every 20 years we will impanel a commission of citizens to meet and determine whether there are provisions in our state constitution that should be amended or whether there's new provisions that should be added. And As I said, that occurs every 20 years. This happens to be the year. So that 37-member commission was impaneled in March. They started having their meetings, which will go through May of next year. And by May of next year, they will then tender some, a bunch, or none, proposed amendments to the Constitution. What's also unique about that commission is that unlike the other mechanisms for putting a ballot initiative out there for the voters to choose for a constitutional amendment, is that it doesn't go through the court system. This is an independent body. So normally when the legislature puts something on the ballot by adopting a joint resolution between the House and Senate, that then goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can strike it down or let it go onto the ballot. When there is a typical petition drive, like with the medical marijuana thing that passed recently, where you have to collect a certain number of signatures. In Florida now, it's about 753,000 signatures you have to collect. If you go out and get that many signatures, you can also get on the ballot, but again, that also goes through the courts. But the mechanism through this Constitutional Revision Commission, or CRC, goes directly onto the ballot. And so that 37-member group has been meeting since March. They'll continue to meet. They have to submit to the Department of State and the Supervisors of Elections their list by no later than 180 days prior to the next election cycle. So if you do the math, it comes out to like May 10th of next year. So for the next 12 months, you'll see the CRC traveling around the state. Their goal is to meet twice in so many locations that every Floridian could reach it within an hour. And if you do the math on a state like Florida, that's a lot of meetings. They're going to do every one of those and then do every one of those again. And they're in the process of those. It's a public meeting. People come forward to the podium and say, here's what I'd like to see added, removed, or amended in our state constitution. And by the way, we go to every single one of those around the state. And a fair number of people come forward from local governments and speak about preemption and ask that the constitutional provisions regarding home rule authority and preemption at a minimum not be weakened, but potentially be strengthened. So with that, Madam Mayor, I'll take any questions.
So what are the bills that you think will make a comeback? The CRA bill, will that?
I think so. I think the CRA bill will probably come back. I think the vacation rental bill will probably come back. I think the gun bills, the Second Amendment bills will come back. None of those passed this year. Those were essentially pieces of legislation that would expand the extent to which people are allowed to utilize their concealed carry permits in some spaces where they currently aren't now. There's arguments on both sides of that. Some people argue that the places where some of these terrorist attacks are taking place are where people are the most vulnerable, and where people are the most vulnerable is where people know that they're unarmed, and therefore if you allow them to be armed, they'll be less vulnerable. It'll be known that they're less vulnerable, and the number of attacks will go down. That's one theory. Of course, there's competing arguments about the sanctity of certain locations, particularly ones where emotions run high, where maybe you don't want access to firearms. And so those issues are very hotly debated. There were several of those bills this year. They did not pass, but there's strong feelings on both sides. So I expect those bills to get signed again. Excuse me, to get filed again.
What about the election cycle bills?
50-50 chance. It didn't really get that far.
Questions?
Remember, legislators only have so many bill slots on the House side, and so if something looks like it's going to be a waste, they usually won't use a bill slot for it, unless they're just doing it to satisfy a constituency.
Lynn?
Jerry, I just returned from the Institute for Elected Municipal Officials, and there was quite a lot of chatter about the home rule going away. Can you give us any kind of an update on that specifically?
Yeah, I don't think home rule goes away, but I do think that, look, the answer to some of those questions ultimately forces you to cross the Rubicon of ideology, and whether you believe that government should be bigger and more centralized, or whether you think government should be more dispersed and at the local level. Most people are conflicted in that they see the value in both, depending on the circumstances. It's in the application that you then get bills like this. All right, so most people would recognize that, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, that there are certain things that are legitimate for regulation almost solely on the federal level, right? Our military, our national security, all right, that's an obvious example. And that some things should naturally be done on the local level, speed limit in a neighborhood, all right, that sort of thing, all right? But in between there, even as to speed limits in the local government, if you get some city or some county or a host of cities who get together and say, hey, we don't like a particular type of driver, and so we're going to use the speed limit to prevent those kind of people from being in our neighborhoods, then even though you may believe that speed limits in neighborhoods should be a local authority issue, it's not irrational to think that some legislators are going to say, yeah, but if you're abusing that, we're going to shut that down. And if the only way to prevent abuse of local authority is to bump it up, then we're going to bump it up. And that's what happens. And so, unfortunately, the sins of some are visited upon the others. And that's what I see is behind a lot of these anecdotal bills. I don't think there's a trend towards eliminating home rule. It is kind of ironic. There's a certain irony, though, that the people who generally are more tuned to the center or right of center, who tend to be more federalists and want less government and less centralization of government, are now filing some of these preemption bills, but they're doing it the common theme is freedom, it's liberty, and they're doing it for the same reason. It's just a different result. They worry that at the local level there are some municipalities who are taking away people's freedoms, and they want to stop that. I can remember back in 2000, there were a couple of cities who were essentially, enacting local ordinances that all but eliminated people's right to keep and bear arms. And you can say, well, you could file a suit against them and challenge it under the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, but that takes a decade and millions of dollars. In the meantime, those people were denied that right. And I remember that was a bill that I voted for. I co-sponsored that bill to not allow local governments to do that, because that's something that is fundamental, it's inherent, and that's not something that should be subject to local control. So it's a long-winded answer, but I don't think the idea or the goal is to eliminate local control. I think the idea and the goal that these people are getting at is to prevent bigger government wherever it is, whether it's in Washington or whether it's in a small community, from stripping people of their liberty.
Okay, the reason I asked that question is because the speakers in this case were talking that Mr. Corcoran is on a mission to get rid of home rule before he leaves office.
I don't think that's true. I mean, if you're asking me my opinion, I don't think that's, I've never heard him say that. Okay. I've heard him speak passionately about some of these individual issues, but it seems to me, from what I hear from him, that it's anecdotal. It's based upon those specific issues. I've never heard him give a speech about the ideology of eliminating local control. Okay. But he does have there's a libertarian aspect to some of his ideology, and I think the simple truth is to understand whether it's a jury or a host of elected officials to try to predict what they're going to do. It's, the skill is to figure out why they're doing what they're doing. And I think the why they're doing what they're doing is out of freedom and liberty and a perception that on some of these issues, people's rights are being stripped away, and they want to stop that, whether it's pushing back against Washington or pushing back against a small town. I don't think that there's an ideology that says let's eliminate home rule.
Okay, thanks.
Nancy?
Well, my question is kind of related to that in some regard. Back to the Save Our Homes and the increase. Who wouldn't want to lower your tax obligation? On the other hand, I was at a meeting and I observed our state delegation in somewhat of a cavalier attitude, saying, and we passed this and it's going to save you tax dollars. And it's like, whose tax dollars? It's not state tax dollars, it's local tax dollars. And I understand that, you know, there may be some local governments that are not as frugal as we are.
Good answer.
And don't go through the transparent processes that we have in place. On the other hand, it's, who are they kidding? Because a local government can find ways to get the money that they need. So it's like, and they're, you know, they're standing there saying, look what we did. And it's like, you know, if you really look beneath it all, it's just, I just thought it was.
Part of that message too was, well, you have 2 years to plan. You have 2 years to plan for the implementation of it. So that was part of the message.
Yeah, you were at the meeting, Rachel. You saw them. And so it was, it just really rubbed me the wrong way. And nobody said anything at the time. But it gets back into the home rule and the local issues. And, you know, we can change the way we do things here. We've avoided having assessments like the plague, and really go through a very critical process to determine what we're going to do. But we can find ways to do what we need to do. So it's I just thought it was really kind of like, okay, if you're going to save dollars, save it at the state level. And so really,
Well, of course, that's their budget.
yeah.
But
So, and I don't want our homeowners here to you know, misinterpret.
Yeah.
It's not, I'm not saying we need to, you know, tax people. I'm all for saving my own tax dollars.
Sure.
So it was just an observation that I thought was just really, kind of goes along with this home rule kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, I have the benefit of traveling all over the state and being in Tallahassee and seeing, not only seeing essentially every municipality in the state, but also seeing their perspective and their messaging and their advocacy and a lot of briefings on how every municipality is being managed and running itself. And I can tell you that City of Punta Gorda is a model. If every municipality managed its finances the way that you did, there would probably never be one of those bills even filed. If the city of Punta Gorda, if every other city, you know, conducted itself the way that you do on things like the shared economy, there'd never be an Uber bill filed. And it's very difficult when I stand here before you and have to explain some of these bills that maybe don't translate well here locally. But I can just tell you there are parts of the state where they do appear at least to translate. So, for example, in the middle of a debate like that, it's pretty easy for some of these legislators, not maybe from our delegation, but other legislators, to point out the amount of waste, fraud, and abuse of funding that's taking place in some of those other locations that make a tax cut or a tax exemption like that almost self-evident. You need to control that. But it's not because of the way that you conduct yourselves. It's because of what others are doing sometimes with most all of these bills.
And from what we heard too, it's a shell game. If you don't vote for that, then you don't get your local projects, and you know you're sure to get cut out of the budget on the local stuff if you go against.
There's times when I mean, this is politics, right? So there's times when when there's negotiation and the issues are paired, and let's not be too naive here. I mean, everybody who's an elected official is an elected official, and so they're running for office, and so some of these issues have those aspects as well as part of their platform. Less government, less taxes, more freedom, and so Florida tends to be generally a conservative state when it comes to taxes. One of the most conservative in the country. It's part of our culture. It's in our zeitgeist, and it builds its way into campaigns, and then that translates into policy proposals for elected officials. Yeah, if all the municipalities manage their books the way that this city council does, you wouldn't see those, I don't think. I mean, you may see some politicians are going to campaign on that no matter what.
Well, I think the Florida League and people like you that, we got to this point of having a lobbyist because we really needed it. And the Florida League and the cities that do have lobbyists, I think they do a really good job. I was talking to him about the small cell wireless, the AT&T guy came here to visit with us. Suddenly he appears. And they did a great job lobbying their side. And I know the Florida League did get some concessions and did get some, benefits for the cities that weren't in the original bill. So, I mean, we just need to keep that process. It's a fight, and every year you got to fight the fight.
It really isn't. I will tell you, the lobbyists who represent local governments, when we all get together and we collaborate together and whip votes together with those places where we can each be effective, the combined weight of that does have a huge impact. Most of these preemption bills got killed. Were there a few that made it? Yes, but the ones that did made it, we were all in the room and got to be a part of modifying it. I mean, there does become a point in time with some legislation where it is clear that it's going to pass, and you better be part of the solution, or you're just going to get left out. So, but the municipalities, lobbyists, when they get together, did have a big impact in a year that had a historic number of these preemption issues come up. A couple other quick topics that I'll mention as to our delegation. Our delegation performed very well this year, even though they were largely new. Mike Grant's not new. He's Representative Grant, very experienced, knows our area, was an extraordinary champion for our community. And as you all know, he's been in the legislature before, and now he's starting a new term, which is wonderful. The other two members of our delegation are seasoned legislators, but hadn't had our area in their districts before. So Senator Greg Stubbe, who had a pretty strong legislative session, and then Senator Denise Grimsley, who has had some connection with Punta Gorda, so at least had some familiarity with it. Although Senator Grimsley has announced that she's running for statewide office, Agriculture Commissioner, and that leaves her Senate seat open. And our good friend Representative Ben Albritton has announced for that. I believe he's the only one who has announced. But as you know, he's a huge fan of Punta Gorda, he's a huge fan of the Punta Gorda RO project. In fact, I was just talking with Tom. He wants to come down and get a tour, an update. And so as soon as there's something that's worth showing as we get past the testing and the boring phase, we're going to bring him down. But our delegation is strong and is only going to get stronger as we go forward. And they constantly say, how's Punta Gorda doing? What can we do for Punta Gorda? I mean, I don't have to ask them, they ask us, which is good.
That is
so
excellent.
Your political capital, y'all have heard me talk before about, the being effective in Tallahassee, and I describe it with the metaphor of a bank account. But it's a political capital account. There's things that you do that make a deposit of political capital, and there's things that you do that make a withdrawal of political capital. And if you want to ask for things, you got to do things. You got to build your credibility. You got to be present. You got to make your voice known. You got to become a known entity, and you've got to be able to make the case for why you need government to help, whether it's funding or a policy issue. When you do that, that's a withdrawal of political capital. People who people who withdraw more than they deposit are in debt. People who deposit more than they withdraw have a nest egg, and they can then go forward and be more persuasive. And I would say that your political capital, the way you've conducted yourself, the way you've reached out to members, the way you got to know, and the way you all came up to Tallahassee, and the way you've gotten to know some of these members, including some who are likely going to be our next senators, has continued to put political capital into your account, and that's good. Your image there, your standing in the Capitol, I would say, is strong. Are you as well known as Miami-Dade County? No, but you're far more known than most municipalities of your size, I can tell you that.
Any other questions, Gary?
Just one issue that I'd just like to know where Tallahassee, what you feel the trend or the flavor is basically on enhanced oil recovery and fracking. That's an issue that I think in the long term is something Punta Gorda needs to be concerned with, and our neighbors to the south have a more acute situation with.
There was a fracking ban bill filed this year and last year. It didn't make it, but it didn't pass, but it made it further than it did the prior year. I think it'll get filed again. The municipalities are becoming more and more vocal on that issue. But of course, there are interests who care an awful lot about the other side, and it's not just big oil. I mean, a lot of the opposition to that is entities that want to make sure that they preserve, as they say, that they preserve an opportunity in the future for energy reliability. I haven't really spent a lot of time looking at what the extent of the reserves in Florida, but it's pretty heavily lobbied bill on both sides. I don't expect that to go away. It will continue to get filed. I can't really make a prediction on whether or when it will pass, but it's clearly a trend moving in that direction.
Yeah, I would just like to add, in the conversations we've had here in council in the past, it's not that we're against enhanced oil recovery, but it's this home rule thing. It's how do we want it within our boundaries? We want to have, I don't want to have somebody sell the oil rights in my backyard, so to speak.
I see.
If it's out out in the country, on a fort, it's one thing. If it's going to be in Gilchrist Park, it's a whole different issue. And I want to be sensitive that we don't lose that type of home rule control as they did in the 50s in California. They're not now. I realize that's an extreme, but and that it's done in a reasonable and safe way.
Okay.
Fracking can be done very, very well, safely. What we really have down here is not fracking; it's really enhanced oil recovery, because it's more of acidification of it to allow the oil to flow rather than the actual fissuring of it. But it's just lumped to that area.
One of the things I could do, Mr. Vice Mayor, is send to you, perhaps through Howard, a copy of the bill, the version of the bill that was filed this year, and then also the staff analysis of that bill that goes into a fair amount of detail of what, the origin of each one of the provisions. I know that last year, Representative Ray Rodriguez, who's just south of us and was the majority leader this year, he filed a bill that sounds an awful lot like the framework that you're describing. It didn't ban fracking, but what it did do is say that if there is going to be enhanced oil recovery, there has to be some standards. And it had a whole list of standards. I could send that, and you could take a look at that, and then let me know if that bill gets filed again, which I suspected it will. That maybe that's something that you'd like us to engage on, or maybe it's even something that you'd want to come up to Tallahassee and have some meetings about.
Because at that point, we are sitting over oil right now, as we speak, or at least it's believed that we are.
One last thing. One thing, I guess I want to preface my colleagues' emphasis that home rule is something that I see is an issue we need to keep at the forefront, only because in this particular session it did appear that next election cycles possibilities are probably governing more than the ideology of the people. And so it's therefore like kind of a local, I guess, the effect on local municipalities, like the effects of this legislation, I think, is really not so considered this year. I think it really was more about one's political aspirations, and so therefore, from our standpoint, I think we do have to really look at that. And that's just something I think just we have to do, because this year it seemed like there wasn't too much courage for a lot of legislatures in terms of pushing back and protecting their space. And so I think that's why we have to protect our space, because it did seem like future aspirations were really what was governing a lot of what was happening this year.
Well said. I mean, it's clearly something that we have to continue to monitor and track, but I do think we do have to do it on a case-by-case basis. What is driving from our perspective, the issue is preemption. From the perspective of the people filing the bills, it's the substance of that individual bill. Yeah. They're not saying, hey, what preemption bill can I file? They're saying, what bill can I file to prevent a government, large or small, from stripping somebody's rights to do something? And then you got to have the debate about whether government should be in that space. But taken together, the pattern looks an awful lot like like a preemption trend. So, Councilman, you make a good point. We have to still look at it that way. We have to look at it the other way as well and pick it off one at a time. I mean, the Uber thing probably doesn't bother us that much, right? But a bill saying that we're going to preempt all authority would. It's a case by case. There were some preemption bills that we just can't, it's hard to compromise on. One of them that we killed this year was the preemption bill that essentially would have preempted all local regulation over all local business regulations. And again, you'd say in our community, well, why would you do that? We don't want to over-regulate our I mean, I'm sure there's examples, but we don't over-regulate our business. But there are parts of the state where it's getting pretty hard for small businesses to make it. And that's what caused that bill, not a desire for preemption, a desire to solve that problem.
Thank you.
Jerry's back on the road to Tallahassee.
Indeed.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and giving us that.
Thank you.
Thank you for the time. I hope I didn't go too long. And thank you for the opportunity to represent you. It's a true joy. It's great for me because it's my home area. And I'm proud of the city of Punta Gorda. As I said before, your political capital is high, largely because of the way you conduct yourselves. You have a great reputation because you're reasonable, you're responsible. You engage when you need to engage, and people respect you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, now would be the time if you have your name submitted for a board or